I've been playing a lot more multiplayer games since upgrading my computer, and because of that, I've been running into a lot more toxic players. All games obviously have some toxic people. I think it's fair to say that some games, such as MOBA games, have a much larger number of toxic players. So let's talk about what elements make some games more toxic than others, how these combine in MOBA games to make them particularly toxic, and how some game devs have tried to make their game communities less toxic. And when I say toxic, I just mean harassment, slurs, etc. from one player to another, but toxicity can obviously take a lot of different forms. So let's get into it. First, let's talk about some basic or fundamental elements for a toxic game community before we get into some more complex reasons, some complex game elements later. Some of these are pretty obvious, but they're really important nonetheless. So I think the most obvious game element is multiplayer. If you're playing a game by yourself, if it's single player, you can't really have a toxic community in the game, right? You're just not interacting with anybody who can be toxic to you. Building on that idea, competition of some form, or a player versus player element is usually needed for toxicity. Not that cooperative games can't be toxic, you'll just find a lot more toxic players in games like League of Legends or Call of Duty than you will in games like Diablo or Borderlands that are just more co-op focused. The more people want to win, the more likely they are to get hyper competitive and curse at their teammates or whatever when things aren't going exactly perfectly. And you can see this from the simple fact that ranked game modes are generally more toxic than casual game modes because of that increased competitive nature, the increased desire to win that leads to that toxicity. And along those same lines, the more teamwork's that required, the more likely you are to have a toxic game. This is because you must rely on other players, so people are going to get more frustrated if they feel that their teammates aren't pulling their weight, whether that belief is, justified or not, and that frustration will lead to very abrasive and sort of rude behaviors. And the final basic or fundamental element is an ability to communicate. So there are some games that are multiplayer and competitive without an ability to communicate. If you can't talk to anybody else, you can't really be toxic. So it's much harder to be toxic in games like Brawlhalla that have much more limited in-game chat options. And this is also part of the reason why Nintendo has such horrible online service since forever. They've always wanted it to be the family-friendly system, the family-friendly company. And if you allow players to communicate with whoever else is playing the game, you'll inevitably have kids who are being cursed out, being told they should go die, the standard things you hear over Xbox Live Chat, which Nintendo understandably has wanted to avoid. Hence, even now with the Switch, it requires you to use this weird app on your phone to voice chat with only friends, except for a couple games like Fortnite that have built-in voice chat systems. So now let's move on and talk about some of the more complicated, or at least slightly less obvious elements that contribute to toxic game communities. I think the fundamentals really establish whether there can be toxicity or whether there will be, where I think these other factors are more important in establishing how toxic a game will be. So first, not all team games are created equal. Games that have teamwork where you're given certain roles or where one person can sync the entire team tend to be more toxic than games that are more forgiving. So in some team games like Call of Duty, where everyone's kind of playing the same role, I think that can lead them to be less toxic than games like Overwatch or Smite, where you have specific roles. People are more likely to get frustrated with you, think that you aren't fulfilling your role, they think that you're really sinking the team by not doing what you should be doing. You'll get comments like learn to heal that are really toxic, specific to this type of framework, specific to games that require each person to fulfill a certain role in order to have the team be successful. Along similar lines, access to more information during the game can actually lead to more toxicity. If somebody knows that you're 0-8, they're more likely to chirp at you, they're more likely to be toxic than if they didn't know how many kills or how many deaths you had. If people can more easily see that you're doing bad, they can more easily be frustrated, they can more easily be toxic to you, they can more easily harass you for how you're playing in the game. Additionally, I think harder to learn games or games with larger skill gaps often have more toxic players. And this is because new players just have a harder time getting into the game, and so when a new player is matched against an experienced player, they get crushed even worse than you would have in a more even game, a game with a smaller skill gap. This in turn will make your teammates more frustrated with the new player for not knowing all the various complex mechanics that are there in the game, which can lead to more harassment and other things along those lines. And finally, I think there's 3 psychological things that also contribute strongly to toxicity in games. First, more frustrating games can be more toxic. The reasoning here is perhaps somewhat obvious. Basically, more frustrated players are more likely to snap, more likely to type things in the chat that they wouldn't say if they had a more level head, if the game wasn't as frustrating. And the second psychological aspect is kind of related to the first. Games that usually have players that play for a long amount of time in a row can lead to more toxicity. If somebody has been playing a game for 5 hours straight, which, no judgment, I do that too, you're more likely to be mentally strained, mentally frustrated, etc. And this in turn will again lead to people snapping, saying things they wouldn't say otherwise, and just harassing other people in a way that they wouldn't do if they had a more level head, if they weren't as tired, if they weren't as mentally drained. And finally, there can be kind of a cycle of toxicity. Once a game has a large toxic player base, it can drive away your regular non-toxic players and make that player base more abrasive as a whole. This can increase the percentage of toxic players, but can also make regular players more toxic because they're more frustrated. You know, if you're being yelled at, if you're being cursed at, as I have experienced myself, you're more likely to do something back that's also toxic, that's also harassing, that maybe you shouldn't type, but you never would if someone wasn't being toxic to you in the first place. So really the reason that I made this video is because I've been playing a lot of Smite recently. I love the game, the variety, the complexity involved, but it has a lot more toxic players than other games that I've played before, and it's really a problem that's marred the MOBA genre as a whole. So why are MOBAs so toxic? So if you've watched the whole video and heard me list out all these reasons that contribute to toxic games, you can probably see that most of them apply to MOBA games. They are competitive and team-based. People know when you aren't doing your role well, which is especially common for new players because of the large skill gap and the complex mechanics to learn. And it's also very easy to communicate that frustration to other players because you can type up comments on your keyboard. You can also use VGS system in Smite, which are basically keyboard shortcuts for chats. And all these games are also long. People play for hours in a row, which can lead to more mental exhaustion and frustration. All these together can lead to more toxicity compared to games like Rocket League, where you don't have specific roles, you can't see everyone's doing as easily, etc. So what have game developers done about this? A lot of people are really tired of toxicity in games, and some game devs have taken active steps to counter it. A lot of the rise of a game like Fall Guys is because they specifically counteract a lot of this toxic nature of games. There's no voice chat with strangers, so you can't be toxic that way. And there's just a lot of general anti-competitive nature of the game. There's an inherent randomness that sort of diminishes the competitive nature. It's a very casual game by how it's made, and there's no leaderboards or things like that, despite some players calling for it. And the devs themselves have explicitly come out as not wanting Fall Guys to be toxic, not wanting it to be super competitive in any way. They really want to fight against that, which I really respect, even if Fall Guys hasn't really stuck with me as a game. More cooperative games can also fight toxicity by changing how they reward players. For example, games like Guild Wars 2 have changed competition in some easy ways by allowing more rewards to be shared, which causes more cooperation for players as opposed to competition in zero-sum game. So in a lot of MMOs, you fight other players to be the one to get the kill, you fight other players to be the one to get the ore to mine, etc. In Guild Wars 2, every player that contributes to the kill gets credit for it, and every player has their own ore to mine, they have their own node, so people can't steal your ore. Because you don't have that competition, you get a lot more cooperative, a lot less toxic player base from a game like Guild Wars 2 versus some other MMOs. But even without redesigning a whole game, there's a lot of simple things you can do to reduce toxicity. As a player, don't be afraid to mute, block, or report toxic players. As a game dev, don't be afraid to punish players who have been toxic, whether you find that through reports, or chat filters and searches, whatever. You don't have to go the Nintendo route of no voice chat, but appropriate monitors on them and actual tangible punishments for toxic players can help. I don't mean you need to ban all toxic players permanently from the game. That's a little extreme, but something to incentivize players to not be toxic. Something that Smite's done that's nice, but maybe not enough, is that you can get some rewards at the end of the season if you haven't been banned, and you can get increased rewards if you haven't been reported for being toxic. Those are just some examples, but basically as a game developer, if you can think of ways to incentivize cooperation, if you can think of ways to de-incentivize toxic behavior, whether it's harassment or whatever, that can go a long way in making your game community be much less toxic, and therefore just more fun for everyone that's playing the game. What do you guys think? Are there any big contributors to toxic games that I've missed? Or what do you guys think about ways to make games less toxic in general? Let me know what you think in the comments, and please like this video to help me out if you found it enjoyable or informative. And please subscribe to see more content like this. I also post a lot of reviews, and you can check those out in the description down below. Thanks for watching.